In the world of railways, bigger usually means better. Bigger driving wheels means higher speeds, bigger boilers means more reserved power, and bigger engines mean longer trains, which means more goods and passengers all being moved at once. Over in Britain, however, where engine size was very restricted, there exists one little engine which shows that size doesn't always matter. In 1936, the Courtaulds textile plant in Flint, North Wales, was in a strange predicament. The plant covered a large area near the sea, but the site was split into two by a railway line connecting Chester to Holyhead. 2 tunnels were dug into the embankment to allow the plant to move people and supplies safely under the railway from one side to the other. However, the height of the embankment meant that the tunnel's roofs were very low. Like most large industries at the time, the plant had its own rails laid throughout the site, and some of them ran under the railway to help move supplies from one building to the other. The low clearance of the tunnels, however, was proving to be an issue, as in order to fit the wagons underneath to get from one side to the other, the ground had to be dug out so that the rails could be laid low enough to provide sufficient clearance. Wagons could now safely pass under the tunnel, but with only 6 feet of headroom, there was still the issue of actually moving them. As most conventional shunting engines would be far too tall to pass through the tunnel, a custom engine was ordered from Peckett & Sons to do the job. In order to decrease the engine's height, some extreme measures were taken. The wheels were only 2 feet in diameter, its cylinders were 8 by 12 inches, a standard saddle tank would have added too much extra height and so side tanks were opted for instead. Its boiler and firebox was tiny, its footplate was positioned several inches below its running board, making the cab look as if it was sort of hanging off the back of the engine, and the cab itself was so small that the driver would have to be sat down to operate it. All of this resulted in a very small, compact 040 tank engine standing at a total of 5 foot 9 inches tall, which cost Courtaulds £840. To put that into perspective, the engine's total height was shorter than the diameter of the driving wheels of these locomotives. With a tractive effort of just over £4,800, despite its diminutive size, the engine was still more than capable of shunting trucks around the site. Courtaulds never gave the engine a number or a name, with most referring to it by its works number 1900. Though the engine had enough clearance to safely pass through, the tunnel still remained an issue. Because the ground had been dug out to provide more clearance, there was a sharp incline at both ends, meaning that the engine would need to work flat out in order to have enough momentum to climb the grade at the other side. One can imagine that with only 3 inches of clearance between the exhaust and the roof of the tunnel, there'd be a brief moment where the crew would get a face full of smoke, soot and steam. Eventually, by 1954, it was decided that it would be far better and safer to install a rope incline under the tunnel to pull the wagons with, and simply have a diesel shunter on both sides of the tunnel to move them around the site. As such, once the equipment was installed, 1900 was sent back to Peckett's for repairs before being moved to Grimsby, where it shunted supplies around a new Courtaulds plant being constructed there. To make the engine more comfortable, the height of the cab was increased so that workers didn't have to sit at an awkward angle while driving it. The plan was for 1900 to work as a shunting engine around the plant once it was completed. However, Courtaulds opted to buy a Sentinel locomotive instead, keeping 1900 to one side as a spare. By 1971, Courtaulds had put the engine into storage and seemed to have little interest in using it again. Seeing such a unique engine no longer in service, the Quainton Railway Society decided to purchase it and restore it to working order. They removed the cab extension and fitted it with vacuum brakes so it could safely pull passenger trains, and by 1980 it was back in steam. Ever since, it's taken on a new life in railway circles as a fun little novelty, and despite its new owners giving it the name Jill, its size has led many rail fans to instead refer to it as the Flying Buffer Beam. Steam engines, like us, come in all shapes and sizes, and while the bigger engines are usually more striking and impressive, the fact that this strange, squat, one-of-a-kind shunter is beloved by so many just goes to show that you don't have to be the biggest or the best to be remembered. Sometimes, just being a little different is enough for people to love you. Romney Hythe and Dymchurch Railway was the dream railway of two millionaire racing drivers in the early 1920s, them being Captain John Jack Howie and Count Louis Zabrowski. In 1924, Count Zabrowski was killed in a racing accident which left Captain Howie alone in his endeavour. Howie failed to buy the Ravenglass and Eskdale Railway and was investigating an old tramway in Sussex when a friend gave Howie the idea of building a railway between New Romney and Hythe. Upon visiting New Romney for the first time in 1925, Howie decided then and there that's where he would build his railway. After obtaining a light railway order and constructing 8 1/4 miles of track, the line was opened in 1927. The railway was 15-inch gauge, several steam engines were built specially for the rails, and services ran regularly between Hythe and New Romney. Howie, however, wasn't satisfied and wanted the line to be extended an additional 5.5 miles from New Romney to Dungeness, as well as having the route double-tracked to allow for more frequent trains. After the extension was completed in 1928, trains ran regularly. The passenger services were expected to make time, with the line being ran like a standard gauge train service despite it looking like a mere attraction. On top of that, the railway was used to pull freight trains, haul ballast, and was even used by the postal service. The railway was also used to pull fish trains from Dungeness Beach, where the fish would be taken to Hythe, and from there be delivered by road. Again, despite its looks, it was a genuine public service and a functioning way for transporting goods. During World War II, the line was taken over by the military as the line follows closely by Dungeness Beach. An armoured train patrolled the line, with some hopper trucks being equipped with heavy armour, a boys' anti-tank rifle and Lewis guns. The line was also used to help construct an underwater pipeline to Normandy to help supply the Allies with fuel after the Normandy landings, which resulted in damage to some of the track. After the war, the line was put back into public service and continued to run, but faced a large decline in freight traffic. In 1967, a railway association was formed to help preserve the line. The line is still running to this day, having provided transport to school children to and from the Marsh Academy in New Romney from 1977 all the way until 2015. Nowadays, the line still runs, but only as a mere tourist attraction. While not quite the express passenger service it once was, it's still a nice ride with a charming view of the beach. Despite its small size, it still worked and functioned like most other railways, proving that sometimes size truly doesn't matter. While fighting on the front lines, it's vital that troops are supplied with all the equipment they need to keep going. Naturally, this includes food, water, ammunition, and some recreational items. While fighting the First World War, many countries decided that what their troops really needed to aid them on the front lines were trains. Pretty soon after the conflict in Europe kicked off, most countries came to the realization that they needed an effective way to deliver supplies to the front lines. Established railways passing through the conflict zones were easy bombing targets, and most roads to the front lines were either destroyed or would be quickly ruined by the constant traffic. What they needed was something that could move large quantities of supplies that could also travel along the same route over and over without churning up the ground beneath it. So of course, they just chose to build loads of narrow gauge railways. The Ducouville Manufacturing Company in France produced prefabricated segments of track for use on construction sites, farms, plantations, and various industries. The track could be very quickly and easily laid down, and the company sold various wagons that could be used to move around materials and supplies. The French military took an interest in the rail system and adopted it, primarily using 600mm gauge tracks around its strongholds to move troops, ammunition, and artillery pieces. The British War Department took an interest too and adopted a similar system. By the time war had fully broken out, these railways became essential. Because the tracks were in prefabricated segments, they could be easily laid by soldiers or inexperienced workers along the trenches and to and from the front lines. More stable rails were laid beside mainline railways so supplies could be easily transferred to the narrow gauge trains. From there they could be delivered to the trenches, and subsequently any injured troops or damaged equipment could be moved out safely via the railway. If a line was targeted by enemy artillery or served a trench that was no longer being used, it could be very easily moved around or pulled up and replaced. Most of the wagons used on these railways were small and could be easily pushed by men or pulled by horse around the trenches, where the track segments tended to be too haphazardly placed for the locomotives to safely run on them. Eventually, Germany, Russia, and America adopted this system too. The locomotives that ran on these lines were primarily built by France, Britain, and Germany. However, the US helped by sending locomotives built by Baldwin and Alco. Most of these engines were built to be light, powerful, and easy to maintain, with the most common designs being 460 or 262 pannier tanks. Most of these engines were also fitted with short lengths of flexible pipe to allow them to refill with water from ponds, puddles, and flooded shell holes. Later, diesel engines were brought in to help, with some of them even being made out of modified Model T Fords. These engines were by no means fast, often described as moving at the speed of a light jog, but were still more than capable of doing the work asked of them. It was often the case that one side would capture enemy rolling stock and use it on their own railways. However, due to the lack of parts to maintain them, these engines were often used until they broke, where they were then either stripped down for parts or sent off for scrap. The engines also had a tendency to derail due to the poor quality of the tracks. However, their relatively light weight and size made them very easy to re-rail. Their main issue, however, was that the smoke and steam they produced made them very easy to spot by the enemy, and as such were heavily targeted. To get around this, most supply trains were either operated at night or during heavy fog. For daytime supplies, a locomotive would deliver them close to the front, and horses would pull the train the rest of the way. Eventually, daytime supply trips were made by the diesel locomotives that were brought in to help instead. These rail systems worked well, and by the end of the war, hundreds of miles of narrow gauge line had been laid all across Europe. Afterwards, most of these railways were used to help rebuild areas that had been destroyed by the conflict and eventually pulled up, with a few remaining as permanent lines. Most of the locomotives, rails and rolling stock was sold on as army surplus, finding a new life being used on plantations, farms and industries all over the world. A large number of these engines have since been preserved. In the end, trench railways were perhaps one of the more unsung heroes of the First World War. As weird as it seems to just throw down a railway line in the middle of a war zone, they did prove to be a massive help on the front lines, keeping the soldiers going. So, if you ever find yourself on the front lines, be sure to bring some railway tracks with you, as you never know how handy they could be. Many attempts have been made over the years to double the power of steam locomotives, resulting in some interesting and unusual designs. Garretts, Fairleys, and Malays are just some of the ways engineers tried to get the power of two locomotives in one, but all of these come with their own drawbacks. Germany too was one such country to try and tackle this problem, but their solution to doubling an engine's power was to simply double the number of engines. By the 1880s, the adoption of narrow-gauge field railways by many European countries proved to be a massive boon for their armies, as it allowed troops, supplies, and heavy ammunition to be easily transported. The only issue was motive power. Since the rails were usually hastily laid on uneven ground, most conventional locomotives would derail, and so horses, donkeys, and mules were used to pull the wagons. Despite the rough conditions, a powerful locomotive capable of running on these tracks was still a very desirable prospect for most armies. The locomotives would need to be easy to repair, re-rail, refuel, lightweight, and work reliably, all while being flexible enough to tackle steep grades and sharp bends. A very tough set of criteria to meet. Many countries came up with their own designs, and by the 1890s, the armies of the German Empire found theirs. It was an idea patented in 1855 by Robert Stephenson and Company, but who originally proposed it to the German armies and when isn't well documented, but the idea was this: have a pair of two smaller tank engines coupled back to back. While at first this idea seems a bit daft, there were some genuine advantages to it. For starters, having two locomotives immediately means twice the power. and because they were coupled together in the middle, they could essentially articulate, allowing them to negotiate bends better than a fixed frame design. The total weight was also spread out between two locomotives, helping decrease axle load. Only one crew was needed to drive and fire both of them, with the controls of the front and rear engines being mirrored to make it easier for the driver to manage. When coupled together, the engines could be driven in both directions without issue, and should one engine break down, the other would still be able to keep working. Then there was the added bonus that the engines could be uncoupled and work as two separate machines, effectively doubling the amount of engines you have to work with while shunting. The first pair of these engines was built in the late 1880s by the Hohenzollern Locomotive Construction Company, but the most common design came from Krauss in 1890, these being 600mm gauge 060 engines, measuring at 8.2 meters long, 2.7 meters tall with 580mm driving wheels, a pair of 180 by 240mm cylinders, Stephenson valve gear, and a top speed of 20 km an hour. Despite being two separate locomotives, they were regarded as one unit, with both sharing the same number, the engines being individually distinguished by an A or B on their cabs. The A units had a slightly taller cab roof than the B units, allowing the cabs to overlap and provide better protection for the crew. The design was adopted by the Bavarian and Prussian Heeresfeldbahnen, and became known as Zwilling or twin locomotives. They were used by many parts of Germany's army, but their most noted use was in Germany's colony in southwest Africa. In 1897, the German Feldbahn Baukommando was tasked with building a line across the Namib Desert to connect Swakopmund to Windhoek. It was initially intended to be operated with mules and donkeys, but it didn't take long for steam power to be used, with the Zwillings being the ones to primarily run the line. Over 50 pairs were sent to southwest Africa, but it was here the engine's shortcomings were quickly found. Their bunkers and water tanks were found to be too small for long-distance work, meaning they had to stop and refill frequently. Special water tenders were built for them to use in Africa, which would be pulled behind the locomotives with a pipe connecting the tender to their water tanks. And while these did help improve the engine's range as well as provide seating for armed escorts, it was still a hassle that was unnecessary on many other engine designs. On top of that, it was found the engines were considerably underpowered for the work they were intended to do. Yes, doubling the engines does effectively double their power, but at the end of the day, adding another weak locomotive to the front of a train just leaves you with two weak locomotives. The Zwillings couldn't always be operated paired back to back on steeper lines either. If a grade was too steep, there was a risk of the water in the boiler of the rear engine flowing to the smokebox end and leaving the crown sheet exposed. As such, it's noted on some occasions that both engines needed to face the same way in order to safely climb hills, requiring more crew to operate the other engine. One can only imagine how uncomfortable the footplates would have been with no rear protection when running the engines split apart in illing formation in adverse weather. And to top it all off, drivers and firemen had to effectively look after two individual locomotives. Monitoring and maintaining the fire and speed of one locomotive is challenging enough, so crews needed to either work twice as hard or have an extra pair of hands to help them properly operate both machines. 182 pairs of locomotives had been built in Germany by 1914, though on the German Wikipedia it states that 454 double engines were made by this time. While the German army wasn't keen on the engines, the Japanese were, and from 1905 over 80 pairs of Zwillings were acquired for use by the Japanese army, with most of them coming second-hand from Africa after the railway was converted to Cape Gauge in 1913. They were used in the trench railways of the First World War by Germany, and some even ended up in the hands of Turkish state railways, but by then Germany had developed other locomotives such as the 8-wheeled brigade engines, which were simply more powerful and easier to use. The last of the Zwillings was built in 1905, and by 1920 most had been sold off for private use in factories and mines, including the ones sold to Japan. A handful of variations on the design were made by a few other manufacturers, but these never performed any better than the standard Krauss design. Out of all the Zwillings produced, only one has survived into preservation, this being number 154A, currently on display outside of Windhoek Station in Namibia. Considering the difficult conditions military engines needed to handle, the Zwillings were a very interesting solution to the problem. While it seems they were more than capable of traversing the rails as intended, their lack of range and power combined with how complex they were to operate together just made them more trouble than they were worth. It's a shame really, as they were such a unique idea that had some very useful benefits. Let them be a reminder then that, as effective as it is to double your power, you're more often than not doubling your problems too. As long as there have been road vehicles, there have been people modifying and rebuilding them to run on railways. Most of the time this is done for fun or simply to cut corners, but it's often the case that a road vehicle modified to run on a railway is less effective than an actual purpose-built locomotive. There have been exceptions, however, the most effective of which involved traction engines. Born in 1824, Thomas Aveling became an apprentice to a farmer, and by 1851 ran his own farm in Rukkinge. In 1859, he noted how portable steam engines would have to be towed around by horses, and felt that it was a waste of time given that these engines could produce enough power to drive themselves. He modified a Clayton and Shuttleworth portable engine so that it was capable of moving under its own power, resulting in the first ever successful traction engine. The engine also had the power to plough, pull heavy loads, and kept its flywheel so it could power threshing machines, saws, and other farm equipment. After refining the design, he started his own company to sell the engines, eventually partnering with Richard Porter to create Aveling and Porter. Aveling continued to develop his machines, inventing the steamroller in 1867. While steamrollers and ploughing engines were their biggest sellers, like many other companies at the time, Aveling and Porter also decided to build railway locomotives too. Most other manufacturers would build locomotives from the ground up as locomotives. Aveling, however, felt that it would be easier to instead simply modify his existing traction engines by mounting a traction engine boiler onto a new set of frames and replacing their road wheels with flanged railway wheels. They produced a handful of small tank engines in 1865 for use on both standard and narrow gauge railways, initially using a 220 wheel arrangement, with the rear wheels using the same gearing and drive as their road-going counterparts. Aveling also produced an 040 design using a chain to connect and power the driving wheels, though later designs swapped this out for a large gear instead. These engines mostly found themselves working in quarries, dockyards, harbours, and various tramways, but weren't quite as fast or as powerful as many other contemporary shunting engines, most rarely having more than 10 horsepower thanks to their small boiler and single cylinder. Their lack of oomph, however, was more than made up for with their practicality. Their gearing allowed them to tackle relatively steep grades with ease, their weight and size meant they could handle tight bends and poorly laid rails in quarries and harbours, and the engines retained their flywheels, meaning they could power auxiliary equipment such as stone crushers, grinding mills, and pumps if required, saving the need for extra stationary or traction engines to work on site. Their speed was rarely an issue anyway, as most places they worked required them to operate at low speeds. Despite their lack of horsepower, they were still able to handle heavy loads. It being noted they were able to haul 15 loaded wagons totaling 45 tons around the Gray's Chalk Quarry. Another aspect that made them popular was their affordability. Aveling and Porter's engines were cheap to build and modify compared to other industrial tank engines, most units costing about £530 each. They also consumed a minimal amount of fuel, most estimates working out to less than 5 pounds of coal needing to be burned for every ton hauled. As such, the engines soon paid for themselves in fuel savings alone. And finally, what made them more preferable for industrial work than a standard engine was how easy they were to operate, as the locomotives possessed the same gearing and controls as road traction engines. As such, workers familiar with traction engines could easily operate them, and new workers could learn the controls quickly, meaning the company didn't need to hire qualified engine drivers. Aveling and Porter built just over 40 locomotives for industrial use, but most found their niche as shunting engines in quiet yards and quarries. As practical as they were, their lack of power led to many busy industries opting for more conventional shunting engines instead, as they were often faster, stronger, and made to keep up with a constant heavy workload. But for places such as gasworks, distilleries, and quarries, where only a handful of wagons would need shunting over a short distance, they were ideal. The last Aveling and Porter locomotive was built in 1926, though by this point the design was considered out of date. Regardless, a handful continued to work until the 1960s before finally being withdrawn. 5 of Aveling and Porter's locomotives have been preserved, including Sydenham that worked the Erith Oil Works, Sir Vincent that worked the British Oil and Cake Mills, and Blue Circle that worked the Holborough Cement Works. The Aveling and Porter locomotives, while certainly not the best shunting and short-distance engines to have been built, their simplicity, affordability, utility, and overall practicality made them a pretty useful asset on many railways. Considering they were the 19th century equivalent of bolting locomotive wheels to a tractor, they turned out pretty good. All that being said, just don't expect to make the next great shunting engine by swapping out your car's tyres for some steel wheels. Some railways are remembered for being the first in their country to open, some are remembered for being the first in the world to use steam power, and some are remembered for being the first to traverse certain difficult routes. To this day, however, there still exists one little railway that holds the unique title of being the first railway in the world to be preserved. It's not some historically significant rail line, nor is it a rail line that revolutionised travel, but rather a small, unassuming slate railway on the coast of Wales. In the early 1800s, slate quarrying started to become a big industry in Wales. The slate industry remained steady until 1861, when the American Civil War broke out, cutting off supplies of cotton to the mills of northwest England that depended on it. Many mill owners decided to look elsewhere for enterprise, and some turned their attention to the slate mines of Wales. One of these quarries was the Bryn Lewis quarry near Abergynolwyn, which was taken over by William McConnell. At the time, the quarry primarily transported slate to Pennell by horse, but McConnell felt that output from Bryn Lewis could be significantly improved with better transport. He put in plans to build a railway from the quarry to Tywyn, and from there to the port in Aberdyfi. By 1863, however, the Aberystwyth and Welsh Coast Railway had reached Tywyn, and so plans were scaled back to just build the line between Tywyn and the quarry. The track was built to the unusual gauge of 2 foot 3 inches, and in 1864, 2 locomotives were ordered from Fletcher Jennings & Co. to work the line. The first being delivered that same year and the second arriving in 1866. In 1865, the railway was permitted to operate passenger trains. Upon inspection, however, it was found some aspects of the line made it unfit to transport passengers, such as some of the bridges having inadequate clearance on either side of the carriages, making it difficult to exit the carriages should the train ever have to stop. To solve this, the rails were shifted to one side and the carriage doors to the right were fixed shut, providing passengers with enough space to exit in these tight spaces, but also meant the carriages could only be entered from one side. On top of this, the 2 locomotives also required further modifications to make them safer, with number 1 Talyllyn having a set of trailing wheels fitted to stop excessive vertical motion, and number 2 Dolgoch having its springs and crank pins adjusted to stop excessive horizontal motion. After this, the line was declared fit for service and was officially opened to the public in 1866. For the next few decades, the line ran without incident and helped boost the productivity of the quarry. Extra stops were added along the line for passengers, and it even proved to be very popular with tourists. By 1910, however, the future wasn't looking so bright. Demand for slate fell dramatically, and the quarry was only producing half the amount it initially did. With the money gone, McConnell saw no use in renewing his lease on the land. This caused quite a stir around Abergynolwyn, as the quarry was the largest employer in the area. Local Liberal MP Henry Hayden Jones saw the concern and stepped up to buy the quarry. He kept both it and the railway running, but barely turned a profit from the endeavour, with the line mostly making money from tourists. The slate and seasonal holiday trains kept the railway going, but by 1946, a massive collapse in the quarry led to it being shut down. Hayden Jones vowed that the railway would run as long as he lived, and as such, passenger services continued, albeit only for 2 days a week. Jones eventually died in 1950. On top of this, the Talyllyn was one of the few railways that wasn't nationalised in 1947, meaning the railway was left without an owner. At this point, the line was a mess, the rails were worn, and both the engines were hardly fit for service. Number 2, Dolgoch, was the only engine running and had to be sent away for repairs multiple times. Meanwhile, number 1, Talyllyn, was so worn out that its firebox and boiler were deemed beyond use or further repair, with it still carrying its original boiler from 1864. It was only steamed in emergencies and ran at low pressure, being described as less of an engine and more of a self-propelled bomb. While this would be the end for most railways, something unusual happened. Author Tom Rolt had visited the line in 1949, and after hearing the news of its impending closure, wrote a letter to the Birmingham Post saying what a shame it would be to lose the line after nearly 85 years of service, calling for a rescue of the railway. Surprisingly, a large number of people backed the idea, including wealthy business owner Patrick Whitehouse. A committee soon formed headed by Rolt and Whitehouse, and negotiations started with Hayden's executors on acquisition of the line. The Talyllyn Railway Preservation Society soon took ownership and began publicising its efforts to try to raise money and awareness of its mission to keep the line running. By May of 1951, 650 people had joined and the railway was running again. It wasn't just locals either. For some reason, people from all over the country just didn't want this little Welsh railway to close. Running the railway, however, was much easier said than done. Dolgoch was the only engine able to operate passenger services and worked like a dog trying to keep the trains going. Fortunately, the Talyllyn managed to acquire 2 more engines from the recently closed Corris Railway. Number 3 and number 4, renamed Sir Hayden and Edward Thomas respectively, were brought to the Talyllyn to take over the work of the now completely worn out Dolgoch. Edward Thomas was in need of an overhaul itself, and as the railway hadn't the money to do it, John Alcock of the Hunslet Engine Company kindly offered to do it for free as a show of support. Sir Hayden was mostly used to run the railway with Dolgoch. Though it was capable of doing the work, Sir Hayden kept coming off the rails. Nobody knew why, as the Corris Railway was also 2 foot 3 inches, same as the Talyllyn, until it was found that the line was built half an inch wider than it should have been to accommodate number 1's longer wheelbase. Talyllyn and Dolgoch had both been given wider wheel treads to help compensate for the difference. This meant the entire line needed relaying to its correct gauge. In the meantime, Sir Hayden was given broader wheels to amend the issue. By 1953, word had spread far and wide of the little Welsh railway that was being kept open out of passion. Tom Rolt had written the book Railway Adventure based on his experience at the Talyllyn, which worked as the inspiration for the film The Titfield Thunderbolt. This not only helped boost the Talyllyn's popularity, but also inspired others to do the same for their local railways. Kit Davidson, an American filmmaker, also came and filmed the railway, producing the short documentary Railway with a Heart of Gold. This publicity helped the railway gain more visitors, which in turn increased popularity and provided the railway with much needed revenue. Not only did this allow them to relay the line, but also meant they could afford a diesel to help with the work, as well as get both Talyllyn and Dolgoch back into into working order. Another engine, Douglas, was donated in 1953, having formerly worked at RAF Calshot, and in 1957 the BBC made a broadcast about the railway, boosting publicity even further. As the line developed, a museum was opened at Talyllyn featuring various different displays and locomotives from all over the country, as well as detailing the history of the railway. While it might not sound like much nowadays, a railway run entirely by volunteers was something practically unheard of at the time. The idea that people were taking time out of their day to lay rails and run trains for no pay at all was bizarre, but kindled a feeling of camaraderie among many rail enthusiasts. The chance to work on or drive an engine yourself was also an appealing factor to many, but most that worked the line simply just did it out of love. One of these volunteers was Reverend Wilbert Awdry. Awdry filled in as the guard for the Talyllyn and fictionalised the engines of the line in several of his railway series books. The massive success of his books combined with the scenery of the railway has since guaranteed its survival. The railway was even permitted to dress up the engines as their fictional counterparts for special days out. Awdry and the railway continued to work with each other until his death in 1997. Afterwards, part of his study and his model railway were donated to the museum at Talyllyn, where they have since remained on display. Since then, the railway has become famous the world over, attracting tourists from across the globe to come and take a ride along 7 miles of beautiful Welsh scenery. For over 150 years, the line and its engines have run from the coast to the hills and proudly continue to do so to this day, still surviving on donations and the work of volunteers. What was once just another decrepit slate railway has since become a global tourist attraction. The Talyllyn Railway started its life as nothing special, just a little line to carry slate, but thanks to years of effort has become an icon of railway preservation. A bunch of people getting together to preserve a railway had never been done before, and the Talyllyn proved that it was possible, making way for other heritage railways that followed afterwards. But most importantly, what the Talyllyn does is remind us that no matter how rough or damaged you may be, all it takes is for folks to give a little love to make you special. Throughout railway history, there have been many examples of extremely small engines living long and interesting service lives, such as Gazelle and the Flying Buffer Beam. The thing is, these engines are one-of-a-kind, specially built units designed to fulfill a specific purpose. So what would you get if you were to build an entire batch of dinky little tank engines? The answer is disappointment. By the turn of the 20th century, many railways had found rail motors to be an ideal way of transporting passengers in urban areas and on low-traffic branch lines. However, they also came with some considerable drawbacks, most notably was their lack of power and flexibility. Because the engine's boiler had to be small enough to fit in the carriage without taking up too much space, their power was severely limited, and as such they often struggled on busy days, with their lack of strength also meaning they couldn't pull an additional coach to make up for their limited passenger space. Not helping was the fact that the engine and coach were permanently attached together, meaning you couldn't use one without using the other, significantly limiting the kinds of work they could do. As these issues became more apparent, the London and South Western Railway urgently needed some new engines to help work light passenger services, and so in 1906, their chief mechanical engineer Dugald Drummond came up with a quick solution. He felt that the simplest solution would be to essentially take the engine unit out of a rail motor and beef it up a bit. The rail motor units were compact, meaning they were already ideal for working in tight urban areas, and so all they really needed was a boost in performance in order to do the work required. The end result was a compact tank engine with an 8-foot wheelbase, 3-foot driving wheels, 10 by 14 inch cylinders, side tanks, and the unusual wheel arrangement of 220. They were designed to work push-pull services similar to the rail motors, but with enough strength to pull extra carriages on busy days, and because they weren't fixed to the carriages like the rail motors, it was much easier to shunt and arrange them, making them much more flexible to work with. Drummond also fitted them with water tubes, which were tucked away in the engine's side tanks. Classified as C14s, 10 were ordered, the first engines being built in 1906, with the final 2 being completed in 1907. They were put to work and tested on multiple services, and though they proved to be much more flexible than the rail motors, they left much to be desired. Because, as it turned out, taking the poor-performing engine unit from a rail motor and turning it into a locomotive leaves you with a poor-performing locomotive. For starters, they weren't very powerful, only having a tractive effort of 4,950 pounds, meaning they could only just pull one full carriage, never mind two. Not helping was the 220 wheel arrangement, so even if the engine did have the power to move the carriages, it only had two wheels to apply it with. The C14s suffered greatly from wheel slip, not only when starting trains, but also when travelling at speed too. Not that they had a high top speed given their relatively small driving wheels. Their size also greatly limited their range too, as it was found their bunkers could only hold 1 ton of coal, just enough to make a short trip at best. One can only imagine how frequently they'd need to refill with water too, given the diminutive size of their water tanks. And finally, they were just a pain to maintain. While their size would have made cleaning, maintenance and turnaround times fairly quick, the water tube system Drummond designed them with was made inaccessible by the water tanks, making routine maintenance of them next to impossible. As a result, the C14s were only in service for a few years before being put to one side, only seeing use on rare occasions. Drummond naturally felt that he could do better, and in 1908 designed an 040 version of the C14s, these having bigger boilers, bigger cylinders, the water tubes removed, and with all 4 wheels being powered. 5 were ordered from Eastleigh Works, however it took until 1910 for the first 2 to be completed. Classified as S14s, these proved to be twice as powerful as their 220 counterparts, but not powerful enough to justify building more, and as such the rest of the order was cancelled. In 1913, the new chief mechanical engineer of the LSWR, Robert Urey, ordered that 4 of the C14s be rebuilt into 040s, likely to try and get some use out of them, but only 2 were converted by the time the First World War broke out. With a dozen useless passenger tank engines on their hands, the LSWR was more than happy to sell 9 of them, including both the S14s, to the War Office and Ministry of Munitions in 1916 and 1917, for use as shunting engines and to do other odd jobs around munitions facilities and dockyards. By the end of the war, only 3 C14s hadn't been scrapped, these being numbers 741, 744 and 745. All 3 had been converted into 040s by the time they came into the ownership of Southern Railways in 1923 and were put to work as dockyard shunters, occasionally taking on departmental duties. As Southern Railways was focused on electrifying most of their lines, like with many other Southern steam locomotives, the C14s were never really replaced, and as such eventually ended up under the ownership of British Railways. BR continued to use them as shunters and odd job engines, with 744, now numbered 30589, getting to pull one last passenger service in 1952. Eventually, 2 of the engines were withdrawn and scrapped in 1957, with the final C14 being withdrawn in 1959. None were preserved. What's interesting to note is that because of their unique size, no spare boilers were ever built for them, meaning that all of the C14s kept their original boilers their entire working lives, the ones in the BR engines being over 50 years old by the time they were cut up. So despite the flaws in their design, you certainly can't argue with their build quality. Whether you think the C14s were rubbish from the start or just little engines that never found their niche, let them be a lesson that it's rarely the size of something that matters, but whether or not it was properly thought through. If there's one thing railways are good at, it's moving materials in bulk. Not just long distance, but short distance as well. Many mines, quarries and factories found railways to be an ideal way of moving things around a site, especially large or heavy goods like blocks of stone or machine parts. One of Ireland's most notable industrial railways, however, wasn't built to move stone, coal or steel, but beer. Founded in 1759 by Arthur Guinness, the St James's Gate Brewery in Dublin produced stout beer for the people of Ireland. Guinness's beer proved to be very popular, not just in Ireland but in Britain too, beating out most of its competitors and becoming one of the most dominant breweries in the world. This success, however, came at a price. The original 4-acre brewery was unable to keep up with demand, and so the site was expanded out to 50 acres. But this led to further issues moving all the raw ingredients, brewing waste and barrels around the even bigger site. Horse tramways and horses and carts were initially used, but were found to be slow and unreliable. By 1873, the brewery was producing close to 750,000 barrels of Guinness a year, with demand only increasing. Something had to be done to keep the beer flowing, and with the site being so big, it was proposed the brewery build a rail system all throughout the facility to move supplies internally. Supervising engineer Samuel Gagan settled on 22-inch narrow gauge track and specified that the rolling stock would have a maximum height of 6 foot, width of 5 foot, and no gradient on the line would be greater than 1 in 40. All the wagons used on the line would be custom built to fit within the loading gauge. Work began on laying the rails, but Gagan soon faced another problem. The newly built brewery facilities that were closer to the River Liffey were also 50 feet lower down from the main site. Initially, his solution was to install a hydraulic lift to connect the two, but its limited size meant it was only able to lift one wagon at a time, which was not only slow, but meant breaking up and reassembling trains. Realising how time-consuming the lift was, Gagan instead had a tunnel built under St James's Street to connect the two sites, installing a spiralling track in the old brewery which went down 35 feet. Once the line was done, 8 miles of narrow gauge track had been laid throughout the brewery, which not only connected the entire site, but also ran along the quay by the river and a canal harbour next to the brewery to help load and unload barges with supplies and beer. Naturally, a railway needs engines to run it, and so the brewery bought an 040 tank engine from Sharp Stewart & Company in 1875, being numbered 1. The engine, however, proved to not only be underpowered, but was also difficult to maintain. As such, number 1 was quickly put to one side once the brewery got hold of 2 more powerful engines a year later. Number 2, hops, and number 3, malt, were much better performers than number 1, but they too were found to be maintenance heavy and were known to damage rails as they ran on them. Another 2 engines were ordered from Sharp Stewart in 1878, but it was found dirt could easily enter their moving parts, again meaning more maintenance. Fed up of all these inadequate engines, Gagan ended up designing his own locomotives to work in the brewery. His design was an 040 side tank engine with the cylinders mounted on top of the boiler, and a vertical connecting rod connecting the cylinders to the wheels. The engine's frames spanned the full height of the locomotive, with the cylinders and tanks being fixed to the frames rather than the boiler. By removing the pins and connecting rods, the engine could be easily lifted from its spring frames to make maintenance much easier, and the cylinders had casings over them to prevent dirt from clogging them up. A locomotive using Gagan's design was ordered from Avonside and arrived in 1882, numbered 6. The design proved to be successful, so the brewery ordered another 3 engines 5 years later from a local engine builder, William Spence. Anytime the brewery was in need of more motive power, another batch of Gagan's engines were ordered from Spence. By 1921, 19 of these engines were operating the line. The narrow gauge engines, however, didn't just work inside the brewery, but sometimes took short trips outside too. Shortly after the narrow gauge line was completed, a tramway was built from the site to Kingsbridge Station, now known as Euston Station, which was just around the corner. The line was built to Irish standard gauge, 5 foot 3 inches, totaling 2 miles in length, including the tracks in the yard around the brewery. The job of this line was to connect Guinness to Ireland's rail system to help bring supplies in and take beer out. Horses were initially used on this line, but when the time came to get a locomotive, Geoghegan felt that rather than buy another engine to shunt on the line, he could instead use one of the many narrow gauge engines at his disposal, and so he had 4 custom haulage wagons built as a means of allowing the narrow gauge locomotives to run on the broad gauge track. These were essentially frames the locomotive could be lowered into. The narrow and broad gauge rails were interlaced over each other, and a hydraulic hoist would lift the locomotive up so a frame could be rolled beneath it. Once in place, the engine's wheels would contact a set of rollers, geared at a 3:1 ratio, which would in turn power the haulage wagon's wheels. And just like that, you have a broad gauge engine. Despite their size, these engines were quite powerful and hard-working. On average, one engine alone would be able to move 8,000 casks a day, and when in a haulage wagon, were able to move 13 fully loaded broad gauge wagons at once. All the same, by 1912, the brewery decided to get a proper locomotive for their tramway, and bought a 4-cylinder petrol locomotive. The engine turned out to be quite unreliable, and so 2 steam tank engines were ordered from Hudswell Clark shortly afterwards. The first arrived in 1914, but the second wasn't completed until 1919 due to the First World War, each numbered 2 and 3 respectively. Both followed the standard Hudswell Clark design, but with 3 major changes. They were regauged to run on Irish rails, had their wheels and motion covered for public safety, and were equipped with a bell to warn pedestrians while moving. The bell was connected to the engine's motion, and so would ring automatically as the engine moved, with the driver capable of enabling and disabling it when needed. The bells, however, were quickly removed. Firstly, because the engines never moved faster than walking pace while on the road with a flagman walking out in front for safety anyway, and secondly was due to the amount of complaints the brewery received from patients at a nearby hospital. Both of these lines and all the engines allowed the brewery to run like clockwork, but by the 1940s the steam engines were starting to become uneconomical to run, and so the brewery decided to pursue diesel alternatives instead. In 1947, a 37 horsepower diesel was built for the brewery, and after a successful trial, another 11 were helping work the site by 1950, with a broad gauge diesel also being brought in to serve the tramway in 1949. Both lines continued to serve the brewery and moved an impressive amount of beer, until 1965. By this point, Dublin was looking to widen the road the tramway travelled along, which meant pulling up the line and relaying it. With road lorries now able to do the same work with less hassle, Guinness saw no point in relaying the tracks, and so the tramway was finally closed on the 15th of May 1965. At the same time, parts of the narrow gauge line running throughout the brewery were already out of use, with many other parts seeing less traffic. By 1975, Guinness was using much more modern equipment throughout the brewery, and so the narrow gauge line was deemed no longer necessary and removed, though by this point most of it had fallen out of use anyway. Guinness sold most of their rolling stock for scrap, but kept 1 Geoghegan tank and 1 diesel engine for display purposes. 4 more of Geoghegan's tank engines have been preserved by enthusiasts, along with many of the diesels and engine number 3 which was used on the tramway. Not much of either of the original railways remain, apart from a few rails that are still set in the ground at the St James's Gate Brewery. In the end, though Guinness certainly wasn't the first major brewery to build its own railway, nor the biggest, you can't deny that it absolutely held a unique appeal of its own, and had its own fair share of curiosities. A bunch of small tank engines might not quite be as whimsical as a load of little orange men running around singing about chocolate, but in my book, I'd say it was just as good. Steam locomotives come in all shapes and sizes to do all manners of work, be it compact to make it easier shunting around mines and factories, or ridiculously large to haul long, heavy goods trains over steep gradients. Naturally, the more impressive and eye-catching engines tend to be much bigger and grand in appearance, but there exists one engine that reminds us that size isn't everything. In 1892, work began on a new line for the Lancashire, Derbyshire and East Coast Railway connecting Chesterfield to Lincoln, along with the construction of several other branch lines. Businessman William Burkitt and his brother Samuel dealt in seed and corn, with William running business in West Norfolk while Samuel operated in Chesterfield. Samuel farmed 385 acres of land along the new railway line, and so William had an interest in the line's development, not only as it would be beneficial to their business, but also because he was somewhat of a rail enthusiast. William Burkitt thus decided he wanted his own private engine, though it's not entirely known what his reasoning was for getting one. It's widely believed that he simply wanted an engine he could travel around in to do business, while others have speculated that it was for use on the dockyard railway he owned, or that it was simply an act of a businessman fulfilling a long-time dream of owning his own steam engine. Regardless, he contacted A. Dodman & Company Limited and ordered a locomotive. Dodman built traction engines and fairground equipment, but were known to repair smaller shunting engines for nearby railways, and so took on the job, creating from scratch possibly the only steam locomotive in the company's history. By January of 1893, the engine was complete, and the result certainly looked like something cobbled together out of spare fairground parts. The engine was a tiny, single-driving 222. Its cylinders were 4 inches in diameter, its driving wheels were 3 foot 9 inches wide, it weighed just over 5 tons and stood a total of 7 foot 9 inches tall. To put that into perspective, Talyllyn, a narrow gauge locomotive built nearly 30 years earlier, is longer, heavier and has bigger cylinders than this standard gauge design. Despite not having a cab, the engine did possess some basic comforts, such as passenger seating in place of its bunker and wooden wheels for a quieter and more comfortable ride. Named Gazelle, it was taken for a trial run from King's Lynn to Downham Market and back, where on the return trip it reportedly averaged a speed of 43 miles an hour. It was taken back to the works for some minor adjustments before being handed over to Burkitt. In total, Gazelle had cost Burkitt about £250. In 1897, with permission from the railway, he travelled 105 miles on Gazelle from King's Lynn to Chesterfield, making the run in 5 hours and 10 minutes, and the return trip in 5 hours 25 minutes. Despite Gazelle proving to be a reliable little chariot, records indicate that it was rarely used by Burkitt, likely due to him pushing 70, and after his brother Samuel died in 1898, he seemingly never used it again. He tried to sell Gazelle in 1900, but with no luck, and as a result it was put to one side. William Burkitt died in 1906, and with nobody interested in keeping the engine, it was eventually sold to a scrap dealer in 1909. In 1911, Gazelle was picked up cheap by Colonel Stevens for use as an inspection engine on the Shropshire and Montgomeryshire Railway. After a few months of work, Stevens had Gazelle modified, converting it to an 042 with smaller driving wheels and a few smaller adjustments to help it run on the line. Once the line was fully opened in 1912, passenger traffic was very light, and so Gazelle was repurposed again as a passenger engine. But instead of pulling a carriage, passengers would ride on the seats in Gazelle's bunker. After a complaint from a local vicar, Stevens had Gazelle fitted with a cab and a separate compartment for passengers. The compartment had a luggage rack fixed on its roof, which was a foot lower than that of the cab, was entirely enclosed with small windows, a door that only half filled the doorway left passengers exposed to the elements, and was described as having all the welcome appearance of a portable prison cell. It's likely Gazelle was only used like this on quiet days, but by 1916 it was decided it would be much better if it instead pulled a carriage. The carriage was made of an old horse-drawn tram that had been modified to run on the railway, as any other conventional carriage would have likely been too heavy to pull. The introduction of rail motors to the line and a decrease in traffic resulted in Gazelle being stripped down in Kinnerley Yard by 1932. However, William Austin, who took over from Colonel Stevens felt Gazelle still had some use, and put it back to work in 1937 as an inspection engine and for pulling private parties. The Shropshire and Montgomeryshire Railway was eventually taken over in 1941 by the War Department, due to all the factories and ammunition storage sites it served. Obviously Gazelle wasn't cut out for the goods work, but did still help the railway by running ahead of important trains to ensure all points were set correctly and to counteract any attempts to sabotage the line, occasionally moving small loads of ammunition. Gazelle came out with a few war wounds for its trouble too, losing the top of its chimney and being bashed in a shunting accident. A petrol trolley soon took over Gazelle's job, and it once again ended up stored in a siding. But for many of the men working the line, Gazelle had become a sort of mascot. As such, when British Railways took over the line in 1950, they gave it to the War Department on permanent loan. Gazelle was put on display at the Longmoor Military Railway, later moving between various museums before finally making its home at the Colonel Stevens Railway Museum at Tenterden. It's still debated whether or not Gazelle is the smallest standard gauge steam locomotive in the world. I suppose it depends on how you measure it. But for an engine of its size, especially one built out of spare fairground equipment and traction engine parts, to go through so much, you have to admit it certainly earned its place in preservation. Just goes to show that biggest doesn't always mean best, and that the little things can often go a long way. Subscribe for more.